The Tau Empire was born not from faith or chaos, but from design. In a galaxy built on blood and superstition, they forged a civilization of order, symmetry, and purpose. Every caste, every world, every thought was arranged with mathematical precision beneath the silent doctrine of the greater good. To serve was to exist, to obey was to live, to question was to cease being Tau. From the first orbital colonies above Tau to the shining worlds of the fifth sphere expansion, they expanded with the confidence of inevitability. No empire in the stars appeared so clean, so rational, so certain of its destiny. The Fire Caste formed its burning heart. They were bred for discipline, molded through generations of warfare into living extensions of tactical calculus. The Earth Caste shaped their technology and infrastructure. The Water Caste spoke diplomacy into existence, and the Air Caste carried them between stars. Above them all, untouchable and eternal, stood the ethereals. Their guidance was never questioned, their presence never resisted. It was said that in their company, anger faded, fear dissolved, and loyalty became as natural as breath. When an ethereal entered a room, silence fell, not through command, but through reverence that bordered on biological instinct. For Shasui Tevar of the Fire Caste, this was the only world that had ever existed. His life was a sequence of campaigns, each fought for the same reason, each ending with the same result: compliance. He was a product of genetic refinement, of social engineering perfected across centuries. His reflexes were precise, his emotions disciplined, his will synchronized with the rhythm of the Empire. He had killed for the greater good. He had burned cities so that order might be built upon their ashes. He had seen the light of plasma purify the dark of ignorance and believed it holy. When he was chosen for the fifth sphere expansion, he felt pride, though the word itself was dangerous in Tau lexicon. Pride implied self, and self implied deviation. Among the Fire Caste, there was no I, only we. Yet Tvar felt something close to pride as he stood upon the viewing deck of the expedition vessel Sasea's Hope, watching the fleet form up for translation. Rows of sleek, white hulls reflected the cold light of a distant sun, each bearing the sigil of the greater good, a circle within a circle, perfect and complete. To him, it was beauty made tangible, the visible proof that his species had surpassed the chaos that devoured the rest of the galaxy. Their destination was the human world of Corveza, a mining planet recently brought under imperial reclamation after centuries of neglect. Reports described it as primitive, a hive of industrial decay, its atmosphere thick with toxins, its inhabitants reduced to laboring worshippers of a corpse god. To the Tau, it was a world awaiting enlightenment. For Tevar, it was another opportunity to extend perfection. The descent began with precision. The expedition moved according to doctrine. First the Water Caste envoys, armed with words of cooperation, then the Earth Caste surveyors, marking zones for reconstruction. Finally the Fire Caste, descending like the edge of inevitability. Their orders were clear: minimal casualties, maximum compliance. The greater good was not conquest, it was correction. Tevar's dropship entered atmosphere amid the pale glow of re-entry, shields flaring blue against the friction. Below, Corveza spread in dull grays and blacks, its surface scarred by mines and refineries. As the ramp lowered, he smelled what the reports had not captured: acrid smoke, chemical rot, the stench of unfiltered life. The humans stared as the fire warriors marched through their streets, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. Some fled, some knelt, some cursed in languages the translation drones barely registered. Tevar felt nothing. Pity, perhaps the detached pity of one who sees an animal suffering from its own ignorance. These were not enemies, he told himself. They were the unenlightened, the unaligned, the unshaped. Soon, they would be folded into harmony. Command established headquarters in the shell of a human administrative complex, its walls already stripped of imperial symbols and replaced with the circular emblem of the Empire. There, Tevar saw an ethereal for the first time at close range. A figure draped in flowing robes of silver and white entered the hall, moving with deliberate grace. His eyes were large, calm, and impossibly deep. Around him, even the hum of machinery seemed to soften. Tavar felt the change instantly, a calm that spread through his body like warm current through cold water. The tension in his muscles vanished, his breath slowed, his thoughts, once scattered by the noise of combat, aligned like magnets under an unseen field. The ethereal spoke. His voice was low, melodic, precise. Each word resonated with a rhythm that seemed to bypass understanding and flow directly into the nervous system. He spoke of unity, of compassion, of efficiency in all actions. He praised the Firecast for their discipline and reminded them that even in war, harmony was the truest victory. Tavar listened, enraptured. For the first time in his life, he felt something resembling love, not personal affection, but devotion, so complete it erased the boundary between self and purpose. If the ethereal had ordered him to die at that moment, he would have done so without hesitation and with joy. Later, alone in his quarters, the sensation lingered. He tried to analyze it, to categorize it as training-conditioned reverence, but it was deeper than that. The calm he felt in the ethereal's presence was not a thought or belief, it was a state of being, and like all perfect states, it was artificial. The thought was small, fragile, and easily dismissed, yet it marked the first fracture in the immaculate surface of his faith. Days passed. The occupation proceeded with efficiency. The human governor surrendered the primary continent, and resistance was scattered into the mountains. The empire moved swiftly to replace infrastructure, to repaint symbols, to erase history. Everything that was imperfect became raw material for perfection. It was during this process that Tavar began to notice anomalies. He had been trained to see patterns, enemy formations, supply routes, tactical vulnerabilities. Now, he saw patterns in people, earth-case technicians who avoided certain topics when ethereals were near, water-caste diplomats whose eyes glazed over in identical expressions of serenity, fire warriors who moved with synchronized precision beyond what mere discipline could produce. It was beautiful, but beauty repeated too perfectly becomes grotesque. The more he observed, the more he felt the echo of that first silence, the heartbeat of his own mind, faint but insistent, beneath the song of obedience. Once, during a patrol through the industrial outskirts, he caught his reflection in a cracked window. The armor was immaculate, the stance correct, yet the eyes that looked back at him seemed foreign, as if belonging to someone observing rather than participating. He remembered the ethereal's voice and the wave of calm it carried. He remembered the exact sensation of his will dissolving. What disturbed him was not that it had happened, but that it had felt so good. Perfection was seductive. It offered release from doubt, from choice, from self. The greater good promised not happiness, but peace, and peace is the slowest kind of death. Tavar continued to fight, to command, to execute his duties with flawless precision. Outwardly, he was the ideal warrior. Inwardly, he began to catalogue moments that did not fit. The disappearance of an Earth-caste researcher who questioned resource allocation. The identical phrasing of reports submitted by entirely different teams. The absence of emotion in victory celebrations. These were not coincidences, they were design. He began to suspect that what the Tao called harmony might simply be uniformity enforced at a biological level. Still, doubt alone is not rebellion. Doubt is a whisper, easily drowned by the machinery of order. What transformed it into defiance was not discovery, but empathy, a concept the Tao regarded as inefficient. It began when his unit secured a residential zone. Among the rubble, a human child appeared, filthy and silent, clutching something small in her hand. She walked straight toward him, unafraid, her eyes clear despite the ash on her face. She reached up and pressed a crude metal pendant against the leg of his armor before running away. When he retrieved it, he found a double-headed eagle carved in dull brass, the human symbol of faith. On the back, an inscription, "Faith shields the soul when armor fails." He should have destroyed it. Imperial relics were contraband under occupation law, but he kept it, hidden in the compartment of his battlesuit. He told himself it was for study, a curiosity of psychology, yet deep inside, he knew it was something else. For the first time, he possessed an object that belonged only to him, unapproved, unsanctioned, unexplained. That night, he turned it in his hands. The metal was cold, the edges rough, It was a thing of imperfection, a relic of superstition, yet it carried a warmth he could not dismiss. In a society where every emotion was designed, this artifact radiated something unmanufactured. It was not logic, it was not control, it was belief. In the following days, the presence of the pendant became a silent weight. He carried it on every patrol, a secret anomaly within his perfect existence. The more he held it, the more he noticed subtle inconsistencies around him. The fire caste no longer needed to be commanded, they anticipated orders before they were given. The watercast spoke in patterns that repeated exact intonations. Even the ethereal's serenity began to seem less divine and more mechanical. The realization came slowly, like dawn through polluted skies. What if the harmony of the empire was not philosophical, but chemical? What if obedience was not taught, but triggered? When the ethereal returned to deliver another address, Tavar watched closely. He observed the pupils of those around him dilate in unison as the leader entered. He noted the rhythmic modulation of the ethereal's voice frequencies, calculated to induce calm. He saw warriors who minutes before had argued over strategy, now stand still, expressions blank with serenity. And he felt it again, the wave of peace rolling through his mind, smothering doubt, dissolving thought. This time, he resisted. The effort was agony. His pulse raced, his vision blurred, his muscles trembled. The calm that sought to engulf him was not spiritual. It was invasive, like a narcotic administered through the air itself. When the address ended, the others dispersed in quiet devotion, their eyes glassy, their movements uniform. Tavar remained, shaking. He realized that he had not breathed properly during the entire speech. His lungs had forgotten how to disobey. That night, he could not sleep. Every breath felt foreign, as if drawn by a will not his own. His body, his mind, his loyalty, all seemed to belong to something else. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be a prisoner, not of walls or chains, but of design. He opened the compartment of his armor and withdrew the pendant. The crude wings gleamed faintly in the sterile light of his quarters. He read the words again, "Faith shields the soul when armor fails." His armor was failing now, not the ceramite shell, but the invisible armor of certainty that had protected him from the terror of thought. When the light of the greater good begins to dim, what remains is not darkness, but shadow, the space where truth hides. And in that shadow, Shasui Tavar took his first unconditioned breath. The days after Corvasa's compliance unfolded in quiet precision. Reports moved through command channels like bloodstream through a living organism. The ethereals spoke of progress, of peace restored. The Firecast patrolled the rebuilt districts, the Earthcast repurposed the human factories, the Watercast reshaped the language of surrender into one of cooperation. Every act was framed as benevolence. Every conquest was painted as salvation. The planet, stripped of its scars, began to look like every other world in the Tau Empire, sterile, efficient, obedient. For Shasui Tavar, the perfection around him had begun to take on a different color. What once appeared luminous now seemed too polished, too deliberate, as though every surface hid a reflection of something he was not supposed to see. The calm that once steadied him began to feel unnatural, a weight pressing on the inside of his skull. When he walked among his warriors, he sensed that the same current flowed through them all, an invisible thread binding their thoughts in silent agreement. He began to record these sensations in the encrypted personal log permitted to every fire warrior. Each entry was clinical, detached, disguised as field observations. He documented the synchronization of breathing patterns during ethereal addresses, the subtle pupil constrictions, the precise timing of neural relaxation measured through suit telemetry. The data confirmed what his mind resisted. The unity of the Tau was not abstract, it was physiological. The first external confirmation came from an unlikely source. During a routine sweep of a former human data center, Tavar was accompanied by an Earthcast technician named Fiora Ovati. The man was old by Tau standards, his movements stiff from years of service, yet his eyes burned with the restlessness of someone who still questioned. Ovati's work was methodical. His team salvaged information from Imperial machines for analysis. Yet Tavar noticed how the technician hesitated at certain files, copying data to his personal unit with motions too subtle for standard procedure. At first, Tavar ignored it. Curiosity was not a crime, but indulgence in curiosity could be. But as the operation continued, he sensed the man's anxiety measured, contained, but growing. When Ovati approached him later, there was no reverence in his posture, only a kind of desperate urgency. He spoke of patterns, of data repeating across captured worlds, of erased records and deliberate omissions. Tavar listened, saying little, aware that even acknowledging the conversation might constitute dissent. That night, the technician disappeared. His unit was reassigned without explanation, his workspace sealed, his name purged from the daily reports. To most Tau, such things meant nothing. Reassignment was common, records fluid. But to Tavar, it confirmed the pattern. Harmony maintained through deletion, dissonance erased before it could echo. The unease followed him into every aspect of his duty. During inspections, he noticed how the Firecast squads responded to ethereal directives faster than their reflex training should allow. Commands anticipated, not received. Emotions shifting in identical cadence, even their rest cycles aligned perfectly, as if the rhythm of their lives had been synchronized by some unseen conductor. The more he looked, the more he realized that individuality was not suppressed by ideology, it had been engineered out of existence. He turned inward, examining himself through the only instrument available: discipline. During combat drills, he monitored his physiological responses to hypothetical stimuli. When a recorded ethereal voice played through the comms, his pulse slowed, his brain activity entered stable coherence, and his cortisol levels dropped by 37%. The numbers were undeniable. He was not obeying because he believed, he was obeying because his biology had been written to respond to them. Understanding did not bring clarity, it brought terror. Because once the illusion of choice was gone, what remained was not freedom but the recognition of how complete the control truly was. Every Tau who had ever lived, fought, or died for the greater good had done so under the chemical architecture of obedience. The realization infected his perception of the world. The streets of Corvesa, once symbols of progress, became corridors of programming. The banners of the Empire, once proud and shining, now appeared as warning signs marking the boundaries of an invisible prison. Even the light felt artificial, filtered through the perfection of Tau design, stripping the planet of its imperfections and therefore its reality. He still performed his duties flawlessly. No trace of dissent appeared in his behavior. But beneath the calm exterior, a second consciousness began to form. It was quiet, analytical, observant. It studied not the enemy, but the Empire itself. It counted the seconds between orders and execution, measured the distance between loyalty and compulsion. One evening, as the twin moons of Corvesa hung over the reconstructed capital, Tavar returned to the headquarters complex. The ethereal Anel Tarkas was addressing the assembled units. His voice broadcast through the entire command network. The sound flowed like water, smooth and deliberate, touching every corner of the installation. Tavar felt the familiar calm wash through him, the biochemical signal that commanded serenity. But this time, he resisted. He focused on the sound's frequency patterns, forcing his breathing into irregular rhythm, interrupting the resonance. Pain bloomed behind his eyes, as though his skull rejected the act of defiance. The pressure in his head built until it felt as though invisible hands were pressing down on his mind. He almost gave in, but he persisted. Slowly, painfully, the calm receded. Beneath it, he felt something raw and electric, his own thoughts, jagged and uncontrolled, but his. When the address ended, the others dispersed with perfect order. No one noticed the warrior standing motionless amid the crowd, his armor trembling slightly as the artificial serenity drained from his veins. He realized then that rebellion in such a society could never be collective. It could only ever be solitary, one mind against the Empire, one neuron against the design. The following day, his team was reassigned to oversee security at a logistics hub. Routine, efficient, unremarkable. Yet he noticed the presence of water-cased overseers where none were usually required. They observed with detached politeness, their eyes recording everything. It occurred to him that the ethereals might already suspect. The thought should have terrified him, but it only deepened his clarity. He began to test the limits of the control. Subtle experiments, delays in acknowledging commands, slight deviations from formation, minute hesitations in protocol. Each time, he waited for reprimand, for recalibration, for the invisible leash to tighten. None came. Either his actions went unnoticed, or they were being studied. The uncertainty was worse than punishment. During an off-duty period, he visited the human quarter of the city, technically forbidden without authorization, but easily achieved through his rank. The humans had been organized into labor units, their churches converted into data centers or housing complexes. Yet amid the restructuring, remnants of their faith persisted. Symbols scratched onto walls, fragments of scripture carved into broken machinery. Tavar observed them not with contempt, but with fascination. These creatures, so chaotic, so illogical, maintained belief even under subjugation. They had no proof, no unity, no biological harmony, yet they continued to hope. He watched a group of them huddled around a makeshift altar built from scrap metal. They spoke softly, their hands clasped, their eyes closed. The gesture had no tactical value, no survival advantage, and yet it produced something that the Tao's perfection could not replicate: connection born of choice, not control. For the first time, Tavar understood the inscription on the pendant: "Faith shields the soul when armor fails." Back at his quarters, he accessed the personal archives of the occupation network. Every file required authorization, every terminal tracked usage. But his rank still carried weight. He began to trace the genetic and biological research conducted by the Earthcast in service of the ethereal oversight. The data was fragmented, but certain terms repeated: pheromonal signaling, neurohormonal modulation, olfactory receptor mapping. There were even diagrams of neural pathways overlaid with chemical notations. It was not doctrine, it was design. Late one cycle, he received a communication ordering him to report to the command center for evaluation. The message was polite, routine, and absolute. He went. In the chamber, he found Anel Takas waiting, surrounded by attendants. The ethereal's expression was serene as ever, yet the air felt heavy. Tavar stood at attention, his heart steady but his mind burning with forbidden awareness. The ethereal spoke of loyalty, of recent irregularities in communication reports, of minor deviations in command protocols. His tone was soft, but every word carried the weight of judgment. Tavar's sensors detected the subtle change in air composition, the increase of aerosolized compounds typical of ethereal proximity. The biochemical influence began to press against his mind once more. He forced his body to remain still, his breathing uneven but deliberate. The calm tried to seep back into him, smooth and suffocating. Then, without warning, the pendant hidden within his armor pressed against his chest as he breathed. The cold metal bit into his skin, anchoring him to something unfiltered and imperfect. The serenity faltered. The ethereal's words became distant, muffled, meaningless. For a heartbeat, Tavar saw him not as divine, but as biological flesh, glands, scent. A manipulator masked as a messiah. When the session ended, he was dismissed without punishment, only a lingering look of study in the ethereal's eyes. The meaning was clear. He was now an anomaly, an experiment under observation. From that moment, his world split in two. Outwardly, he remained the disciplined commander, loyal, efficient, precise. Inwardly, he became something else, an observer of his own species. Each act of devotion around him appeared choreographed, each expression of harmony an echo of chemical design. The realization no longer horrified him, it transformed him. He began to think of himself as a variable, an imperfection introduced into a flawless equation. Perfection could not tolerate anomaly. The system would either absorb him or destroy him. He resolved to see how far it would go. Days later, the opportunity arrived. Orders came for deployment to the southern highlands, where remnants of human resistance had gathered. A punitive operation, described as routine. Tavar recognized it for what it was, a test. His behavior, his decision-making, his loyalty, all would be measured. He accepted without hesitation. As the drop transport ascended, He looked down at the planet that had become both prison and revelation. The clouds below were dense, veiling the industrial wastelands and the ruins of faith. The pendant hung within his armor, motionless against his chest, a foreign artifact in a universe that worshipped logic. He felt its weight as a promise and a threat. The greater good had built a perfect order, but every order depends on one unbroken truth, and Tvar had found the crack. The fracture was no longer beneath the surface. It was within him now, spreading silently through the structure of obedience, one heartbeat at a time. The mountains of Corvesa were the color of ash. Jagged ridges stretched beneath a sky drained of color, where sunlight fought to penetrate layers of chemical haze left by centuries of human industry. The Firecast's transports descended in formation, their engines cutting through the thin air with surgical precision. Below, the remnants of human resistance scattered among the cliffs, little more than faint heat signatures on Tvar's visor display. The mission brief was simple: eradication, pacification, restoration of order. For most, it was routine. For Tvar, it was theater. Every step, every maneuver followed doctrine so exact that it no longer felt like warfare, but a ritual enacted to reaffirm the perfection of the greater good. Yet beneath the flawless choreography, he sensed tension. His unit's deployment was too deliberate, the oversight too intense. Water-cased envoys accompanied their armored columns, an anomaly for a combat zone. Their presence was not diplomatic, it was observational. He recognized the pattern. The Empire had not sent him to crush resistance. It had sent him to prove conformity or reveal deviation. The valley chosen for the operation was a scar in the land, carved by centuries of mining and erosion. The terrain offered perfect concealment for guerrilla fighters and, more importantly, for manufactured truth. Tvar studied the topography through his tactical display, tracing lines of movement, identifying choke points, analyzing heat signatures. Something was wrong. The enemy's traces were too organized, too deliberate, as if placed to lure them forward. Protocol demanded obedience. Instinct demanded caution. He reported the inconsistencies through the comm channel. The acknowledgement came swiftly, calm and final. Proceed. The ethereals had reviewed all data. There was no error. Tvar obeyed, as he always had. The convoy advanced along the designated route, a perfect machine of metal and discipline. Yet beneath the hum of engines, his mind remained detached, observing patterns, calculating possibilities. Every formation, every adjustment, every signal reinforced a conclusion he could no longer deny. The Firecast were not strategists. They were extensions of a single intelligence, executing commands broadcast from above like limbs responding to the impulses of a central brain. The first explosion shattered the illusion. A tremor of light erupted at the rear of the convoy as a transport struck a buried mine. The vehicle lifted from the ground, metal twisting mid-air before crashing down in a plume of dust and fire. The formation halted, sensors recalibrated. Commands flowed through the network, immediate and absolute. Tvar's readings showed something stranger: heat signatures shifting, converging, yet not matching known human patterns. The ambush came not from the humans, it came from the forested ridge above. Drones confirmed the presence of armed figures, humanoid in outline, but moving with fluid synchronization far beyond human capability. The targeting markers identified them as hostile human insurgents. The data was wrong. Their formation, their weapon discipline, their posture, every movement was Tau. Tvar magnified his feed. Their armor was stripped of insignia, their color dulled to mimic terrain, but the proportions were unmistakable. Firecast battlesuits, his kind, firing upon their own. He hesitated, watching the first volleys of plasma fire tear into the valley below. The command network flared with confusion, orders overlapping, frequencies colliding. Then, clarity returned, cold and perfect. The ethereal presence entered the channel. His voice, serene and unwavering, flowed through every unit. The chaos dissolved. Confusion became obedience. Every fire warrior turned as one, their weapons adjusting toward the designated coordinates, the ridge opposite the actual attackers. Tvar's display updated automatically, marking the false target as confirmed hostiles. His sensors contradicted it. His instincts screamed in silence. Yet around him, his comrades moved with mechanical precision, ready to unleash devastation upon empty rock. The voice in the channel repeated a single word: fire. He didn't. He locked his weapon systems but held them inert, scanning the correct ridge. His data showed movement real targets, Tau weapons, firing patterns identical to their own. The ethereal's voice continued, soft and commanding, filling the air like perfume. His team waited for his cue, their targeting reticles flickering. In that moment, he realized the full extent of control. The ethereal's influence was not command, it was compulsion. The words carried chemical authority that bypassed reason and reached the primal core of obedience. He overrode his suit's auditory input, muting the voice. Silence struck like a blow. The absence of command left him momentarily weightless, untethered from the collective rhythm. Around him, his squad opened fire, plasma and pulse rounds tearing into the false target. The mountains echoed with precision-engineered destruction. Tivar redirected his sensors, confirming his conclusion. The supposed enemy positions remained empty, while the true attackers, his own kind, advanced undisturbed. They were coordinated, methodical, merciless. He recognized their movements, the distinctive gait of Tau-trained soldiers. But these were not ordinary warriors. Their synchronization was beyond natural reflex, beyond discipline. They moved as one organism, directed by a signal he could not detect. The realization settled with surgical coldness. This was not a battle, it was an experiment. He turned his suit's Vox system to a private channel and issued orders to his immediate team: no engagement without verified contact. They obeyed, not because of authority, but because his voice carried the remnants of trust, uncorrupted by the ethereal signal. Together, they shifted positions, aligning sensors toward the real threat. Their data confirmed everything he feared. The insurgents were equipped with Tau-grade technology, operating under ethereal frequencies. They were test subjects or enforcers sent to measure his reaction. When he countered, the response was immediate. The ethereal's voice intensified, resonating even through his disabled comms, vibrating within his skull like an echo of the bloodstream. His team faltered, their movements becoming sluggish, uncertain. Their suit's biometric data spiked, indicating neurotransmitter overload. He realized that the signal was not purely auditory, it was chemical, transmitted through the air, absorbed through the skin, entering the nervous system. His vision dimmed. The calm tried to reclaim him, drowning resistance beneath waves of false serenity. He reached for the pendant inside his armor. The cold metal grounded him, anchoring him in imperfection. He forced his systems to manual override, rerouting oxygen intake through internal filtration, cutting off the biochemical influence. The effect was immediate. The fog lifted. He saw clearly again the battlefield, the deception, the betrayal. He activated his suit's external broadcast and issued a single command: new targets, Western Ridge, hostile confirmed. His team responded out of habit, not thought. Plasma fire erupted toward the true attackers. The precision of the strike shattered the enemy's formation. The false insurgents faltered, their synchrony breaking for the first time. In that moment of disruption, Tivar understood the scale of what he faced. These were not rebels. They were controlled constructs, perhaps fire warriors stripped of will entirely, their minds erased and replaced with programmed obedience. The Empire was testing its own soldiers against perfect reflections of itself. The return fire was devastating. Beams of energy sliced through the haze, striking the valley floor. One of Tivar's subordinates fell, armor rupturing in a burst of light. Another staggered, systems failing. Still, they held position, acting with the instinct of survival rather than command. Above, dropships circled, silent witnesses to the controlled chaos below. Tivar suspected that the observers were not watercast, but ethereal science divisions collecting data on behavioral deviation. Every casualty, every delay, every unsanctioned act would be catalogued and studied. As the skirmish reached its height, new orders arrived through the general channel. They were directed at him. His designation, his rank, his unit all identified. The command was clear: stand down and await retrieval. The voice that carried it was unmistakable: Anel Takas. the same voice that had once filled his mind with peace. Around him, the surviving fire warriors hesitated, torn between loyalty and survival. The conditioning fought against instinct. In that moment, Tvar felt the line within his mind stretch to its breaking point. He knew that obedience meant dissolution and resistance meant death. There was no longer room for both. He deactivated his suit's IFF signature, erasing himself from the network. For the first time since his birth, he existed outside the Empire's perception. The silence that followed was almost holy. No command, no signal, no greater good, only the raw pulse of existence. The battle ended in confusion. The false insurgents withdrew with mechanical precision, their purpose fulfilled. The ethereal ships descended soon after, their landing craft spreading across the valley like silver insects. The surviving fire warriors were collected, their data cores extracted, their memories likely to be cleansed. Tvar remained unseen among the dead, his suit powered down, his vitals masked by static interference. When night fell, he rose from the wreckage. The stars above were faint, their light filtered through the poisoned atmosphere. He looked at them and felt nothing familiar. For the first time, they were not symbols of expansion or unity, they were a labyrinth of cold indifference. He moved through the battlefield in silence, scanning the bodies of his fallen kin. Their armor bore no insignia, their helmets unmarked. Beneath the visors, he found faces devoid of individuality, features identical in proportion, as if cloned from a single template. Their eyes were open but empty, the gaze of instruments rather than beings. Each had a small implant near the base of the skull, a circular device emitting faint bioluminescence, control nodes. He removed one carefully, examining it under the faint light of his visor. The device pulsed rhythmically, matching the cadence of an ethereal speech. It was the interface between biology and obedience, the bridge that bound the Firecast to the will of their masters. Holding it, he understood the full horror of what had been created. The greater good had evolved beyond ideology. It had become a biological system, a perfect engine of control sustained not by belief, but by chemistry, by manipulation at the most intimate level of the mind. The Tau were not united, they were synchronized. The ethereals were not leaders, they were programmers of flesh. Tvar crushed the implant in his hand. The glow died. The silence that followed was deeper than any he had known. He knew that his disappearance would not go unnoticed. The ethereals would trace the missing signature, reconstruct the sequence of events, isolate his deviation, and send retrieval teams. Yet for the first time, the inevitability of pursuit no longer mattered. He had seen the truth. He scavenged supplies from the dead, recalibrated his suit's power systems, and disabled the locator beacon. The mountains stretched endlessly ahead, barren, lifeless, untouched by the perfection of the Empire. He walked into them without direction, guided only by the pulse of the alien pendant against his chest. Its weight no longer symbolized superstition, it symbolized defiance. Behind him, the sky burned with the light of orbital purification. The Empire would erase the valley, cleanse the evidence, rewrite the data. The records would speak of human insurgents, of minor casualties, of victory achieved. No mention of the Firecast units that had fought each other, no record of a Shazui who stopped listening to the voice. As he moved through the desolation, the last echoes of the ethereal's voice still lingered in his memory, smooth, serene, absolute. But each repetition grew weaker, fading into static. What remained was his own breathing, uneven, imperfect, alive. He realized that he was now what the Tau feared most, a thought without control, a cell that no longer obeyed the organism. Far away, above the clouds, the Empire continued to expand, unbroken, unquestioned. Yet somewhere within its endless harmony, a single discordant note now existed. Small, invisible, but real. Tvar carried it with him into the wasteland, the fracture, the ghost of freedom born inside a perfect machine. The wastelands of Corvesa stretched endlessly, broken only by the skeletons of abandoned industrial towers and the drifting haze of ash storms. Tvar moved through the desolation like a phantom, his battlesuit camouflaged beneath layers of soot and static interference. He had disabled every transponder, every link to the Tau data network. For the first time, No signal reached him. The silence was absolute. Each step carried him further from the world he had served and deeper into the truth that had begun to consume him. His sensors registered only ruins, empty outposts, forgotten stations once used during the early stages of occupation. Most were stripped bare, but some retained residual energy signatures, low-frequency emissions masked beneath the static background of the planet's decay. They did not match any standard tau frequency. He followed the readings for days, conserving energy, bypassing patrol routes that swept the region in precise intervals. He slept in intervals of shallow rest, haunted not by dreams but by the rhythm of command words echoing through memory. Even disconnected, fragments of the ethereal's voice persisted like scars burned into neural tissue. The more he fought them, the more he understood their depth. The control he had resisted was not external. It was written into the structure of his mind, woven into the chemistry of his existence. The signal led him eventually to a basin carved between mountains, its surface disguised by layers of toxic fog. Beneath the haze, he found what he had sought, a facility buried into the bedrock, almost invisible to orbital detection. Its design was unmistakably Tau, yet older than anything he had seen in the current expansion campaigns. The architecture was functional, stripped of ornamentation, built not for glory but secrecy. He scanned for access points. The outer defenses were minimal, as if the facility had been forgotten or deliberately hidden from the Empire's current data grids. That in itself was revealing. The ethereals never left anything unrecorded. A structure erased from their archives meant only one thing. It was not meant to exist. Using a salvaged ident sequence from a fallen fire warrior, Tavar bypassed the first layers of security. The interior was preserved by automated systems, still operating under degraded protocols. Cold blue light filled the corridors, reflecting off sterile walls. The air smelled of metal and antiseptic. No life signs registered. Yet the facility's systems pulsed faintly, alive in maintenance cycles that had continued without supervision for decades. He moved deeper, guided by the faint energy signatures emanating from the lower levels. The structure descended far below the surface, too deep for a standard research post. The markings on the walls bore the sigils of the Earth caste, but the configuration of their work suggested higher authorization. He recognized fragments of designations restricted to ethereal oversight. The first chamber he found was filled with stasis pods, hundreds of them lining the walls like sarcophagi. Most were inactive, their contents decomposed or long evacuated. A few still functioned. Within their glass casings lay bodies that were unmistakably Tau but altered, their proportions distorted, their facial structures simplified. The biological signatures indicated suppression of higher neural activity. Their eyes were open, unblinking, suspended between life and oblivion. Tavar approached one of the active pods. Data panels beside it displayed streams of chemical formulas and hormonal ratios. He recognized several compounds, pheromonal control agents, neural pacifiers, synaptic dampeners, all combined into a complex matrix. The subject's genetic profile was labeled as Fire Caste, but the identifiers had been replaced with a single designation, Compliance Prototype. He scanned further. The pattern repeated across every pod. Each subject represented an iteration, a refinement. Notes in Earth-caste notation described behavioral outcomes: decreased aggression, increased obedience, enhanced group cohesion, diminished self-awareness. The experiments had been successful. The prototypes had become the templates for his entire kind. He felt the weight of revelations settle on him like gravity itself. The greater good had not been taught, it had been engineered. The fire caste's loyalty, the water caste's persuasion, the earth caste's submission, all products of deliberate biological design. Each caste calibrated for function, united not by ideology, but by biochemistry. The ethereals were not spiritual leaders, they were the architects of a species-wide experiment. Tavar moved through additional chambers. Data logs detailed the development of the ethereal genome itself. They were not a natural caste, as the Empire claimed. They were a divergent strain, bioengineered to emit control pheromones that influenced the neurology of the other castes. Their serenity, their calm presence, their divine aura, scientific phenomena dressed in spiritual language. He accessed archived reports from early colonization cycles. Phase 1, genetic stabilization. Phase 2, hierarchical conditioning. Phase 3, total synchronization. The deeper he went, the more he understood the scale. The empire was not an empire at all, it was a biological hive, every mind linked through invisible chemical resonance, every decision flowing from a single genetic source. The illusion of individuality existed only as necessary variants for operational efficiency. The Tau were one organism, the ethereals were its brain. He reached the central archive chamber, a vast space filled with data pylons humming with residual power. The logs were fragmented, corrupted by age, but enough remained to form a narrative. Early entries described a crisis, the divergence of the Tau species in their primitive era, the wars between tribes, the chaos of independence. The Earth-caste scientists had theorized that unification could not be achieved through ideology. True peace required biological correction. The creation of the ethereal strain had been their answer. Subsequent entries documented the first deployments. The emergence of ethereals among divided tribes brought immediate harmony. Entire wars ceased within days of their arrival. No force of arms, no persuasion, only presence. The records praised it as divine intervention. In truth, it was the final stage of the experiment. But one fragment caught Tavar's attention. A damaged entry labeled Project Viorla, Secondary Neural Pathways. The notation was incomplete, yet it described attempts to suppress not only aggression, but also higher cognitive variants. The goal: to eliminate the capacity for rebellion at the neural level. The commentary noted occasional failures subjects who developed autonomous cognition. These anomalies were catalogued as neural degradations and scheduled for termination. The term echoed in his memory. He had heard it before. It was the diagnosis given to those who questioned orders, to soldiers who displayed hesitation or introspection. Neural degradation syndrome. He had believed it a disease. Now he saw it for what it was: independence. He stood before the archive in silence, absorbing the totality of it. His existence, his faith, his loyalty, all fabricated to sustain equilibrium. The perfection he had served was not a moral triumph, but a genetic constraint. Even his capacity to feel horror was limited by the boundaries of the design, yet in the face of that control, he felt something stir that no experiment could suppress: defiance. Movement in the corridors broke his reflection. Sensors detected activity, multiple life forms approaching, their signatures unmistakably Tau. The facility was not as abandoned as it had seemed. Patrols, perhaps automated, or worse, the kind of guardians he had fought in the mountains, obedient shells without minds. He retreated into the maintenance ducts, moving through the narrow passages until he reached an observation level overlooking a deeper chamber. There he saw them. Rows of suspended figures connected by cables and fluid lines to a central spire. The spire pulsed with rhythmic light, and with every pulse, the figures twitched in unison. Each body was Tau, each face serene, each expression identical. They were alive, but not awake. Their neural patterns matched a uniform frequency, the same modulation used in ethereal transmissions. At the base of the spire, Earth-cased drones maintained the systems, their motions mechanical, devoid of curiosity. Tavar realized that these were not warriors, not workers. They were conduits. The facility was not simply a laboratory, it was a broadcast nexus. The frequency generated here could influence entire populations, calibrating obedience across vast distances. The ethereals were its avatars, the living faces of a machine that had long outgrown its creators. He watched the pulse for several minutes, entranced and horrified. The rhythm was familiar. It was the same cadence that had guided his every thought, every command, every heartbeat since birth. He understood now why the ethereal's presence radiated calm. It was not their words, it was the pulse of this network, transmitted through them, reinforcing unity, suppressing variance. The hum of the system resonated in his bones, threatening to reclaim him. He gritted his teeth, forcing his focus on the pendant within his armor. Its crude metal edges pressed against his chest, grounding him in imperfection. He activated his suit's recorder, documenting the evidence, capturing the readings. The world deserved to know what lay beneath the mask of perfection. Then the alarms began. The facility's security systems reawakened, detecting unauthorized movement. The corridors filled with crimson light, and automated defense drones emerged from the walls. Tvar moved, silent and efficient, his instincts sharpened by the knowledge that every motion now mattered. He evaded the first patrols, disabling sensors, rerouting power through decoy systems. Yet the deeper he moved, the more the environment adapted, doors sealing, turrets activating. He reached a service conduit leading to the surface. As he ascended, fragments of data flashed through his visor from the network he had breached. A final message displayed on his interface, a transmission routed directly through the ethereal channels. It contained only a single phrase, written in the ceremonial language of the Empire: deviation acknowledged, correction in progress. The words burned brighter than any plasma fire. He emerged into the surface storm, the sky a canvas of lightning and industrial smoke. The facility below began to tremble, energy surging through its core. The Empire was erasing the evidence. From the horizon, lights streaked upward orbital cleansing warheads, descending to sterilize the entire region. The ground split open as the mountain itself began to collapse. Tvar ran, the landscape collapsing behind him, ash and debris raining from above. The blasts consumed the valley, waves of heat rolling outward. He dove into a trench as the shockwave tore across the land, his suit's systems overloading under the surge. When the dust settled, the facility was gone, reduced to molten ruin buried beneath kilometers of slag. He lay among the debris, systems flickering, power reserves failing. His body trembled from exhaustion, but his mind burned with clarity. He had seen the heart of the Empire. He had seen the anatomy of obedience. The greater good was not divine order, it was the perfection of slavery. As his suit powered down, he looked to the horizon where the stars pierced through the smoke, distant and cold. Somewhere beyond those stars, the Empire continued to spread, its harmony unbroken. But he had carried something out of the fire that could not be erased, a truth so simple, so dangerous, that it could unravel the very fabric of their perfection. He was alone, wounded, hunted, but awake. And in that awakening, the greater good had met its first failure. When dawn came to Corvesa, it was made of ash and silence. The mountains no longer existed. They had been reduced to molten plains, their surfaces glassed by orbital fire. No signal rose from the wasteland, no transponder, no data feed. The Empire had wiped its own scars clean. In its records, nothing had happened here. Shazui Tvar crawled from the debris of what had once been the surface access tunnel. His armor was blackened, its plating warped by heat, its systems running on residual power. The world around him was dead. Yet through the ruins, he could feel the faint pulse of life, his own heartbeat, irregular and human in its imperfection. It was proof that he still existed outside the Empire's design. He moved with mechanical determination, every motion a struggle against exhaustion. The facility's destruction had sealed all evidence beneath kilometers of slag, but his suit's data core still contained fragments, recordings, visual feeds, samples of the control implants, scans of the suspended Tau conduits. The truth of their creation, their obedience, their entire civilization, compressed into encrypted data within his armor. He knew what it meant. Possession of such knowledge was a death sentence even if he could return. Yet the thought of returning no longer existed in him. There was nothing to return to. For 3 days, he wandered the wastelands, avoiding orbital scans and automated patrol drones. His suit's power dwindled to critical levels, forcing him to conserve oxygen and heat. He followed the magnetic pull of an abandoned human mining zone, a place once avoided by Tau forces due to residual radiation. It was precisely the kind of place where the Empire would not look for one of its own. The facility he found there was crude, built of metal and stone, but intact. Human insignia still clung to its walls, the twin-headed eagle, blackened by soot. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and chemical decay. He sealed the entrance behind him and collapsed. For the first time in his existence, he slept not because it was scheduled, but because he chose to. When he awoke, the silence remained. No voice spoke through his mind, no pulse guided his thoughts. The world had become frighteningly vast. Choice, that alien sensation, pressed against him with the weight of the unknown. He began to rebuild. Using the remains of his suit's systems, he constructed a crude transmitter, its range limited but functional. His goal was not to call for rescue, but to send the data beyond Corvesa, into the void, to anyone capable of receiving it. He didn't know who might hear. Perhaps no one. Perhaps that was the point. The act itself mattered more than its success. Each day, as he worked, he felt the remnants of his conditioning unravel. Memories returned not of events, but of sensations he had been trained to ignore. The texture of air, the fatigue of muscles, the ache of hunger. They were small, human things, but they reminded him of what the Empire had erased. On the 5th day, his transmitter activated. The data pulsed upward, encoded within standard distress signals to mask its true nature. It would take weeks to travel beyond the system, but time no longer concerned him. The act of defiance had already been committed. He had spoken the first word of heresy in the language of machines. As the signal left the atmosphere, the Empire responded. Long-range scanners detected the anomaly. Within hours, orbital drones descended over the wastelands, sweeping the region with precision. Tavar watched from the shadows as their searchlights carved through the ash. The Empire did not send fire warriors this time. It sent purifiers, silent constructs of the ethereal Inquisition. Their armor bore no insignia. Their faces were hidden behind mirrored visors. They did not speak, because they had no need for words. Their task was not recovery, it was correction. Tavar had prepared for this. He led them away from the transmitter, into the remains of the mining tunnels. The underground network stretched for kilometers, labyrinthine and collapsing. His knowledge of human layouts gave him an advantage, but not for long. The purifiers moved like specters, coordinated by the invisible pulse of command. He set traps, not to kill, but to slow. Explosives, scavenged from mining stockpiles, detonated in calculated intervals, collapsing tunnels, creating noise. The pursuit grew relentless. Each time he disabled one of the purifiers, another appeared, emerging from the smoke without sound or hesitation. They were perfect reflections of what he had once been: disciplined, fearless, unthinking. Deep within the tunnels, the air grew thin, radiation levels spiked. His armor struggled to compensate. Yet in that hostile darkness, he found something he had not expected: remnants of human relics, preserved in sealed chambers untouched by time, symbols of faith carved into metal plates, statues of saints, eroded but standing, books of devotion, their pages fused together by heat, yet still legible in fragments. Words written by creatures who had known despair far deeper than his kind ever could, and still believed. He paused before one of the shrines, studying the cracked image of a human god, crowned in flame, gaze unyielding. The humans had called him Emperor, a title the Tau used as a curse. Yet here, in this forgotten place, that image carried a strange power. It was not the divinity of perfection, but of endurance, the reflection of a being who had suffered and continued to exist. He realized then what separated humanity from his own species. The Tau had built perfection by removing pain. The humans had built survival by embracing it. One had created harmony, the other had created will. The purifiers closed in. Their sensors detected his biosignature. The air shimmered with the charge of plasma fire. He turned from the shrine and prepared to face them. The confrontation was brief and absolute, the tunnels filled with bursts of light and the screams of vaporized air. Tavar fought not for victory but for meaning. Every motion was a declaration that he was no longer part of the machine. When it was done, he stood amid the ruin, armor scorched, energy spent. The purifiers lay broken around him, their systems flickering with residual commands, still trying to stand even in death. He knelt beside one, prying open its helmet. Inside was no living Tau. The skull was synthetic, the tissue grown from cloned substrate. These were not soldiers at all. They were extensions of the system itself, thoughtless, eternal, replaceable. He destroyed the remains, knowing more would come. The Empire would not tolerate deviation. It would purge the entire sector if necessary. He could not fight it through war, only through truth. He returned to the transmitter and modified its code, expanding its range, embedding his message into every navigational frequency. It would spread through the void like a virus, hidden within the routine transmissions of ships and probes. Eventually, someone somewhere would decode it, maybe another Tau, maybe a human inquisitor, maybe no one. But the data would endure. In its final form, the message was simple. The greater good is a lie of design. We were made to obey. I am the proof that obedience can break. If you receive this, remember that freedom is imperfection, and imperfection is life. Dumb. He sent it into the void and watched the signal vanish into the storm. The act left him hollow but free. When the purifiers found the facility hours later, there was nothing left but silence. The transmitter had melted in its final surge. The interior was empty, save for a single marking carved into the wall, the twin-headed eagle, drawn by an alien hand. The Empire declared Corveza purified. The world was sealed, its history erased. No mention of deviation entered the archives. The firecasts that had served there were reassigned, their memories rewritten. The ethereals continued their campaigns, their sermons, their perfect harmony. But somewhere, the message moved between stars, silent and patient. It found receivers not meant to hear it, human traders, rogue Mechanicus units, chaos cults, scavenging through the void. Most ignored it as corrupted data, some studied it, a few understood it. The legend of a Tau heretic began to circulate in whispers across the fringe of the galaxy, a soldier who had seen through the lie of perfection. Among the humans, his story became myth, the ghost of the greater good. To some, he was a defector seeking redemption. To others, a construct of imperial propaganda. But for those who listened carefully, buried within the distortion of the signal, there remained a trace of his voice, calm, steady, alive. Years passed. The Empire expanded. New worlds fell beneath its banners. The ethereals spoke of unity stronger than ever. Yet on certain worlds, whispers persisted. A fire warrior hesitating during prayer. A water-cased envoy pausing mid-speech, eyes distant. Earth-cased engineers complaining of strange dreams of walking through ash, of hearing their own hearts beat louder than the pulse of obedience. The ethereals dismissed it as environmental anomaly, stress reaction, random variance. But the pattern grew. Slowly, imperceptibly, the rhythm of the greater good faltered by fractions. The perfect harmony gained its first discordant notes. They called it a technical error. They did not know it was infection not of the body, but of the idea. Somewhere in the void, drifting beyond the borders of any empire, a small transport vessel traveled between dead systems. Its pilot was not listed in any registry. His armor was ancient, scorched, its insignia erased. Beneath the visor, eyes of faded blue watched the stars without reverence. The pendant still hung around his neck, the metal worn smooth by time. He no longer spoke of freedom or rebellion. He had learned that both were merely stages of the same truth. The universe did not seek perfection, it sought motion. As long as something moved against the current, existence continued. He had become that motion. Wherever he traveled, the pulse of the greater good weakened, not through violence, but through awareness. The Tau he encountered could not explain why their prayers felt hollow, why the ethereal's presence no longer calmed them. They called it a plague of thought. They did not understand that thought was the cure. He left no name behind, no trace of origin, only the faint hum of a signal that carried his message through the stars. And in that endless hum, the Tau Empire began to tremble, not from war, not from chaos, but from the birth of an idea. A single truth echoing in the silence between orders. We were never meant to obey forever. In the cold dark between stars, signals travel like whispers in a cathedral. Most die in static, consumed by cosmic noise, but some endure faint, fractured, persistent. The transmission from Corveza was one of these. It moved through forgotten channels, across abandoned relay stations, bouncing through the warp-twisted silence that separates empires. At first, it was nothing, a corrupted distress call, an echo buried beneath navigation data. Then, slowly, it began to be noticed. On the fringe world of Viorala's outer colonies, an Earth-cased technician named Salor found the anomaly embedded in an ancient communication relay. He decoded it by accident while calibrating long-range scanners. What emerged was not coordinates or a distress beacon, but a voice, calm, deliberate, unlike any he had ever heard. The greater good is not unity, it is the absence of choice. We were made to obey. I am proof that obedience can break. If down. The words repeated, distorted, looping endlessly. Salor did not report the anomaly. He couldn't explain why. Something within the message resonated deeper than duty. For days, he returned to it, listening in secret. The voice carried no anger, no command, only quiet certainty. It made him feel something he had no word for: unease. Soon, others found similar fragments, on mining outposts, on patrol vessels, in abandoned comm archives. Each fragment slightly different, but all sharing the same tone, the same pulse of defiance. The Empire's data systems automatically flagged the transmissions as corrupted, yet the act of flagging them spread them further, embedding them into backup arrays and maintenance logs. The message became a ghost in the machine. Among the Firecast, reports of irregular behavior increased. Soldiers hesitated during compliance operations. Some refused to execute orders without confirmation. When questioned, they could not explain their hesitation, only that something felt wrong. The Ethereals responded with ritual purification ceremonies, reinforcing the pulse of unity through direct presence. For a time, it worked. The dissonance faded, but the silence did not last. In the laboratories of the Watercast diplomacy academies, students began to question their rhetoric. They described sensations of emptiness when reciting the doctrines of harmony, as if the words had lost weight. Their instructors noted the symptoms as minor psychological fatigue. But deep within the Empire's analytical archives, patterns emerged, small, scattered, but growing. The ethereal control matrix was faltering, one molecule at a time. The phenomenon became known, in secret reports, as resonant variance. The Ethereals identified it as an anomaly originating in the neural synchronization frequencies used for indoctrination, yet no technical fix seemed to contain it. The signal adapted, mutating through the same networks meant to suppress it. Wherever the Empire's light reached, the shadow of the message followed. Entire enclaves began to change. On one fringe colony, a fire-cased commander delayed an extermination order against human settlers, claiming they had the right to speak. On another, Earth-cased engineers modified communication arrays to block ethereal broadcast frequencies, citing maintenance errors. It was not rebellion, not yet. It was curiosity. And curiosity was poison. Within the ethereal conclave on Tau Prime, debates erupted. Some declared the anomaly a form of psychic contamination, an echo from the warp. Others insisted it was the result of imperial interference. But a few, the most ancient among them, remembered the early experiments, the buried data, the hidden facility on Corvesa. They knew what this was. It was not corruption, it was evolution. They increased their control measures. Ethereal presence doubled across key sectors. New pheromonal compounds were synthesized, stronger, purer. Broadcast intensities rose until even machines trembled under their frequency. Yet the echoes persisted, diffused across space, immune to authority. Some began to call it the whisper. It was heard in dreams, a calm voice repeating the same phrase, "You were not born to obey." Fire warriors woke trembling, unable to explain their unease. Water-cased envoys found their speeches faltering as words like unity and perfection turned hollow in their mouths. Earth-cased scientists began to record fluctuations in neural patterns across entire populations, small, rhythmic deviations that no ethereal could suppress. The whisper did not preach revolt. It simply reminded them that they could think, and that was enough. Soon, the ethereals began to disappear. Assassinations were whispered about but never confirmed. Some were found dead in their meditation chambers, no wounds visible, their neural glands ruptured from within. Others simply vanished between flights, their vessels lost to navigational errors. Officially, nothing had changed. Unofficially, fear entered the Empire for the first time in centuries. On the world of Firo, a new caste was rumored to exist, nameless, leaderless, bound by no sept or doctrine. They spoke little, acted less, but their presence unsettled the obedient. They carried fragments of old armor, their markings erased. In secret, they called themselves the Free Path. When asked who led them, their answer was always the same: no one. We are led by silence. That silence was Tavar. His name no longer appeared in any record. His existence was erased, his DNA reclassified as corrupted strain. Yet his signal continued to move, replicated through the minds of those who heard it. He had become more than a man. He had become the absence of control, a living void within the Empire's perfection. From the warp, chaos watched with hunger. From terror, the Inquisition took note, but neither truly understood what had begun. This was not rebellion, nor heresy, nor psychic infection. It was an awakening, the smallest spark of self-awareness in a civilization built entirely to suppress it. The greater good remained vast, radiant, unstoppable, but deep within its luminous heart, something unseen had begun to move. An idea, small as a whisper, vast as eternity. Freedom spreads not through conquest, but through memory. The greater good had endured for millennia because it had never been questioned. Now, for the first time, the question existed. Across the Empire, the rhythm of obedience began to falter. It was not rebellion, not yet, but an erosion so subtle that even the ethereals could not detect it until it was already spreading. Orders were executed with hesitation, prayers spoken without conviction. The synchronized unity of millions of minds began to lose its precision. It started in the frontier sectors, where ethereal presence was weakest. A fire-cast garrison failed to execute a cleansing order against non-compliant settlers. A water-cased diplomat altered her reports, protecting those deemed inefficient. An earth-cased engineer deactivated the monitoring network on his colony, claiming malfunction. Each act was small, isolated, seemingly irrelevant, but together they formed the first fracture in perfection. The ethereal conclave convened in secret upon the luminous world of Tau Prime. The meeting chamber was sealed against the outside universe, its walls etched with the geometric sigils of order. There were no attendants, no guards. Only the ethereals, the living architects of the greater good, sat in absolute silence. For the first time in their recorded history, they disagreed. High Ethereal Tavar spoke first, his voice calm but edged with fear. The harmonics of obedience are unstable. Our pheromonal lattice is faltering. Reports of variance increase daily. The whisper contaminates our species like psychic disease. Anshi, elder among them, shook his head slowly. It is not psychic, it is cognitive. Something in their minds is awakening something we buried long ago. The words hung like heresy. Even among the ethereals, there were truths too dangerous to acknowledge. The others stared in silence. To speak of the early experiments, the design of obedience itself was forbidden even at this level. But Anshi continued, our control was never absolute. It relied on balance, chemical, biological, spiritual. We replaced faith with frequency, devotion with pheromones. But harmony cannot be eternal. Even perfection decays. Then we must purify, Var replied sharply. Eliminate the variance before it spreads. We have done it before. Anshi looked at him with quiet despair. And how many times will we erase ourselves before nothing remains of what we were? That silence, that moment of doubt within the very architects of the greater good, was the true beginning of collapse. Outside the conclave, the Empire continued its routine. Fleets patrolled, colonies prospered, industries produced. But beneath the efficiency, cracks deepened. Fire warriors whispered among themselves about strange dreams. They saw fields of ash and stars burning with human symbols. They saw themselves without armor, without orders, walking freely into the void. The dreams felt real, too real. The watercast felt it in their diplomacy, a hesitation when speaking of unity, a flicker of guilt when reciting doctrine. They began to study the words they once used without thought. They realized how easily persuasion could become control. The Earthcast noticed it most. Their instruments recorded anomalies in the neural synchronization fields, minute deviations in frequency, spreading geometrically. At first, they attempted recalibration. The systems resisted. When they purged the variance, it returned stronger. It was as if the deviation itself had learned. Then, the first ethereal died. It happened on a mining colony, orbiting a dying star. Arndal, revered for his serenity, collapsed during meditation. His attendants reported that his neural gland, the source of the pheromonal control, had ruptured spontaneously. There was no violence, no toxin, no enemy, only overload. The harmonics of control had turned inward, consuming the one who created them. Within a week, 6 more died the same way. Across the empire, ethereals reported migraines, fainting, visions of endless darkness filled with a single voice whispering, "You were not born to obey." They called it the Silent Plague. Panic rippled through the castes. The ethereals increased their presence, broadcasting unity with desperate intensity. For a time, it worked. The whispers receded, order restored. But the pressure of suppression amplified the resonance. The more they enforced control, the stronger the echoes became. Entire colonies fell into cognitive dissonance. Fire warriors began refusing neural recalibration. Earth-cased workers formed secret circles to discuss choice. The water-cased, the most attuned to communication, began to speak of consent, a word that had no translation in the Tao lexicon until now. The ethereals called for purification. They dispatched inquisitorial cadres, not human inquisitors, but their own version, fire-cased execution units paired with unarmed ethereal overseers. The purifiers. They descended upon worlds touched by the whisper and erased them from the network. But the purifiers began to falter too. Some froze mid-operation, their minds trapped between obedience and awareness. Some turned their weapons on themselves. A few removed their helmets and simply walked into the void, their faces serene, as if discovering peace in silence. The conclave fractured. Antevar demanded absolute suppression, extermination of every infected world, isolation of entire sectors. Anshi argued that to kill the infected was to destroy what made the Tao alive. "We created a machine," he said. "Perhaps the whisper is the soul we denied it." No consensus came. The conclave disbanded without resolution. For the first time, the ethereals disagreed not on method, but on meaning. The empire's harmony began to unravel, communication delays increased, supply chains failed. On the edges of the fifth sphere expansion, fleets stopped receiving instructions and began making independent decisions. Entire worlds continued functioning, unaware that the pulse of guidance had gone silent. It was the first taste of freedom in 10,000 years. Among those worlds, new doctrines emerged, quiet, heretical philosophies spoken in private. They did not reject the greater good entirely. They redefined it. The greater good was no longer obedience. It became cooperation without control, unity through will rather than design. They called this movement the Path of Tavar. No one claimed leadership, no temples were built. There were no oaths, no hierarchy, only a shared memory, the echo of a voice that once said, "Freedom is imperfection, and imperfection is life." The empire called it rebellion. The followers called it awakening. The two sides could not coexist. The civil schism that followed was not fought with fleets or weapons. It was fought in silence, in the invisible war of thought against control, of will against instinct. Ethereals tried to reassert dominance, but their own glands turned against them, their bodies unable to sustain the pressure of forced unity. The pheromonal fields began to collapse, their harmonic signatures breaking into chaos. Entire castes reverted to confusion, unsure whether to fight, flee, or pray. On some worlds, fire warriors laid down their weapons and removed their helmets, staring at the stars as if seeing them for the first time. On others, earth-cased scientists dismantled the transmitters, tearing down the lattice of obedience with their own hands. The greater good, that radiant perfection that had conquered the stars, began to fall apart, not from external war, but from the return of something it had long suppressed, the soul. By the time the ethereal conclave realized the scope, it was too late. The network of control was broken. Half the empire still obeyed, half no longer could. The pulse that had once unified billions now pulsed out of rhythm, each heartbeat no longer synchronized, and somewhere in the darkness between the stars, a faint signal still moved, the original transmission from Corveza, distorted now by distance, its voice no longer clear but its meaning unchanged. It carried no commands, no promises, no threats, only truth. We were never meant to obey forever. The Tau Empire had always described itself as eternal. It was the light against the galaxy's madness, the embodiment of order where all else was decay. But light, when stretched too far, fractures. And in the age that followed the Whisper, the light of the greater good shattered into 1,000 colors of dissent. At first, the Conclave denied the scale of collapse. They believed the disturbances were temporary neural instability, local contagion, deviation of thought. But the reports continued to multiply. Fleets stopped responding to ethereal command. Colonies cut their links to the central lattice. On the data chains of the Earthcast, entire networks went dark. Their last transmissions nothing more than fragments of human words, ancient and defiant. Faith shields the soul when armor fails. The phrase, meaningless to the Tau language, began to circulate like a virus. Some believed it to be a human weapon, mimetic warfare designed to destabilize the Empire. Others whispered that it was the final truth, hidden within the Whisper itself. On the outer worlds, the Firecast split. Half remained loyal to the Conclave, believing that obedience was survival. The rest followed no one. They called themselves the Unshackled. They no longer fought for conquest but for understanding. Their leaders refused the guidance of ethereals, operating by consensus rather than command. The concept was alien to their species, yet it worked imperfectly, chaotically, but freely. Without the ethereals' pheromonal guidance, the harmony of their movements vanished. Formations broke, orders conflicted, yet something remarkable emerged from the confusion: improvisation. For the first time in recorded Tau history, fire warriors fought not because they were told to, but because they chose to. To the Conclave, it was horror. To the Free Path, it was evolution. As the Empire tore itself apart, the ethereals sought to restore the lattice. They gathered on Tau Prime, within the crystalline towers of the Celestial Dome. There, the last of their kind linked their minds in an act of desperate communion, amplifying their pheromonal output through ancient resonators built in the first age of unity. They called it the final harmonization. Across the Empire, a wave of psychic and biochemical energy pulsed outward, the culmination of every control mechanism ever devised. The intent was simple: to rebind the species, to silence every deviant thought. For a moment, it worked. Millions of Tau froze mid-motion, their minds realigned. Fleets halted, factories stilled, voices fell silent. Even the stars seemed to dim as the resonance spread. The greater good returned pure, absolute, perfect. And then, it broke. The lattice overloaded. The frequencies collapsed upon themselves. The ethereals, their glands strained to destruction, died in silence, one by one. The towers of Tau Prime glowed with unnatural light, their crystalline walls refracting the energy of a dying perfection. The wave reversed. Instead of unity, chaos flooded back through the network. Every suppressed thought, every buried instinct, every silenced emotion erupted at once. The entire Empire screamed. On world after world, the castes turned upon one another. The fire-caste fought not from obedience, but from terror. The water-caste fled into exile, their diplomatic fleets scattered across the void. The earth-castes sealed themselves inside their laboratories, trying to preserve knowledge that no longer mattered. There were no victors, only survivors. The Conclave was gone. The greater good no longer existed. The pheromonal fields that had defined Tau existence for millennia dissipated into nothing. For the first time in their species' history, they were alone, each mind separate, unconnected, ungoverned. Some went mad. Others felt wonder. A world that had once been silent with order now thundered with the noise of individuality. On Tau Prime, cities burned, their perfect geometry warped by rebellion and despair. The surviving fire-caste fought to protect civilians who no longer recognized authority. The water-caste pleaded for peace in languages no one heard. The earth-caste dismantled the remaining lattice generators, believing that to restore them would mean the end of freedom itself. The collapse spread beyond the core worlds. Fleets stranded in the void began to turn inward, each becoming its own miniature empire. Some declared themselves guardians of the true good, pledging to rebuild under new philosophies of unity without ethereal oversight. Others abandoned the concept entirely, seeking meaning among alien stars. But amid the chaos, a new movement began to form, not under command, not through fear, but through memory. The path of Tvar, once a whisper, became a voice. Its followers were scattered, but they recognized one another by the same symbol, a single mark etched upon armor or flesh, an open circle, broken at one point, the symbol of imperfection. They taught no doctrine, they preached no salvation, they simply repeated one truth: we were made to obey. We have learned to choose. Their gatherings were small, secret, fragile, but they spread. On ruined worlds, in drifting colonies, in shattered fleets, the symbol appeared. Even among the loyal remnants of the Firecaste, curiosity began to take root. The inquisitors of the reborn conclave tried to erase it, declaring it heresy. They burned cities, silenced teachers, purged archives, but they could not kill what had no leader. Because Tvar had never sought followers, he had created believers by accident. The humans heard of this collapse through fragments and rumors. To the Imperium, it was another alien tragedy, a civilization imploding under the weight of its own lies. The Inquisition debated whether to intervene, to conquer what remained. But the warp storms that erupted around Tau space made approach impossible. From within those storms came strange readings, signals that defied pattern, frequencies that seemed almost alive. Imperial savants speculated it was residual energy from the collapse of the pheromonal network. But among the Free Path, it was known by another name, the voice of the living will. They believed it was Tvar himself, not in body, but as consciousness diffused across the network he had destroyed, not a god, but a memory that refused to die. And so, for the first time in Tau history, faith was born. Not faith in perfection, but in choice. Not devotion to hierarchy, but to the right to question. The irony was perfect. A species that had built its empire on logic now found salvation in belief. Generations passed. The empire became legend, a myth of unity told in whispers around campfires on forgotten worlds. The Tau who remained evolved into countless splinter cultures. Some clung to fragments of the old order. Others embraced the chaos of freedom. But across all variations, one story endured of a warrior who broke his chains and spoke a truth so simple it changed the destiny of his species. They called him the first heretic. They called him the one who awoke. And in the fading echoes of a dead civilization, his words still lingered, carried through static and silence alike. The greater good was never wrong. It was simply incomplete. For unity without choice is death, and choice without unity is madness. Somewhere between them lies life. The stars no longer remembered the Tau Empire. What remained of its glory had dissolved into dust and radiation, scattered across the void like forgotten prayers. For centuries, silence reigned, where once the pulse of the greater good had echoed through millions of worlds. But silence, too, carries memory. Fragments of the old empire survived, small fleets adrift in the dark, colonies buried beneath forgotten moons, enclaves of scientists and soldiers who had learned to live without command. They no longer called themselves Tau. They had other names now: the Seekers, the Unshackled, the Pathless. Their language changed, their technology adapted. Yet deep within their blood, the remnants of their creator's design still lingered, the faint, ghostly hum of unity, now distorted into something fragile and human. Among them, stories of the past had become scripture, not of gods or conquest, but of awakening. The story of Tvar, the first heretic, was no longer history. It was myth. They said he had been a warrior who heard silence and understood it as truth. They said his voice still traveled between the stars, a signal without source, repeating the words that freed them. Freedom is imperfection. Imperfection is life. Generations passed, and the scattered remnants began to rebuild. They formed small collectives, not empires, not nations, but communities bound by shared will. Each followed its own philosophy, its own version of freedom. Some turned inward, seeking enlightenment through isolation. Others turned outward, exploring the ruins of their ancestors, searching for understanding in the bones of the past. On one of these drifting fleets, a vast, hollowed asteroid named Vala, the last memory, the descendants of the Fire and Earth caste lived together in uneasy harmony. They had forgotten the old rituals, but their instincts remained. The Fire caste, still restless, the Earth caste still analytical. What united them now was not the greater good, but the search for meaning beyond survival. They called their belief the balance. It was neither religion nor science, but something between an understanding that perfection and chaos were two sides of the same motion. Their elders told them that once, their kind had been machines of order, stripped of soul, and that a single act of defiance had given them back their hearts. Among the younger generations, one name stirred more than reverence, it stirred longing. Tvar, not as a prophet or god, but as a question. What did he see beyond the design? No one knew where his journey had ended. Some claimed he had become one with the voice that still whispered through the void. Others said he had wandered into the domain of the humans, seeking the source of faith itself. It was this last story that guided a new expedition. The fleet of Vala turned its eyes toward the Imperium of Man, a realm still burning, still at war, yet still alive. The humans had endured what no logic could explain, endless suffering without collapse. To the Tau descendants, that endurance was the final mystery. How could a species so divided survive when perfection itself had failed? Their vessels were small, silent, built to travel unseen. They passed through the ruins of lost worlds and the borders of imperial space, tracing the ancient signals left behind by explorers long dead. What they found was not empire, but decay, human cities hollowed by war, planets stripped bare by industry and faith. Yet within the ruins, they sensed something their own species had never known, will unbroken by despair. They landed on a moon orbiting a dying sun, a forgotten shrine world once devoted to the god emperor. Its surface was a wasteland of bone and steel, its temples collapsed under centuries of neglect. Yet amid the ruins, they found movement, a human settlement. The humans were primitive compared to the Tau of old, their machines crude, their weapons ancient, but their eyes carried the same fire that had driven them to survive when the galaxy itself had turned against them. The encounter was brief. The humans did not attack. They watched with suspicion, but without hatred. The leader of the settlement, an aged priest draped in rags and metal, approached the Tau envoys and studied them in silence. His voice, when it came, was weary but firm. "We were told your kind vanished," he said, "that your gods died, and you with them." The Tau emissary bowed slightly. "We never had gods," she said, "only architects." The priest considered this, then looked toward the sky where a storm of dying light shimmered across the horizon. "Then perhaps that is why you still live." They spoke for hours, trading words that neither fully understood. The humans spoke of faith, of enduring through pain, of believing without proof. The Tau spoke of freedom, of breaking the design, of finding meaning in imperfection. By the end, there was no agreement, only mutual recognition, two species bound not by peace or alliance, but by shared defiance of extinction. When the Tau departed, the priest gave them a relic, a small, scorched icon depicting a figure crowned in light. He said it was a reminder of a god who had once been man, who had built an empire on obedience and was now silent. The emissary accepted it. She did not believe in gods, but she understood symbols. As their vessel ascended, she placed the icon beside the recording unit that carried Tvar's message. Two different truths, resting side by side, faith and freedom, bound by survival. Years later, the fleet of Vala would disappear into the void, its path lost among the drifting nebulae. Yet fragments of their transmissions survived, carried by ancient data relays and scavenger ships. The humans who decoded them found no threats, no conquests, only reflections. "We met those who built their god from suffering, and we envied their faith. We built our freedom from rebellion, and they envied our peace. Perhaps, in the end, both are illusions. But in illusion, we found life." Those words became the closing verse of the Testament of Tvar, a text now banned across both Imperium and Tau remnants. In time, even the name Tau faded from record. Yet across distant worlds, in the ruins of both man and alien, small symbols could still be found etched into stone, metal, or flesh, the open circle, broken once along its edge. Some called it a mark of heresy, others of hope. To those who still remembered, it meant only one thing: the legacy of the first being who dared to ask why in a universe built entirely on obedience. And in the silence between galaxies, where the last remnants of his voice still drifted through the static, a single phrase continued to echo, unending and unchanged. We were made to obey, but in choosing not to, we became real. Time no longer measured itself in centuries. It flowed in silence, through dead suns and forgotten empires. The galaxy had burned and been reborn 1,000 times, and still the wars raged, human against human, Xenos against Xenos, gods feeding on the faith of the dying. But somewhere in that endless dark, there was a frequency that none could trace. Not a warp echo, not machine code, not prayer, just a voice. It began as static, a whisper that engineers of the Adeptus Mechanicus dismissed as interference. Explorators charting the void between Segmentum Pacificus and the eastern fringe called it the interstice signal, a pattern that repeated every 7 solar cycles, faint but persistent. When translated, it was not a warning, it was a memory. We were made to obey, but in choosing not to, we became real. The phrase baffled Imperial scholars. The Ordo Xenos claimed it was the remnant of a pre-Imperial Tau transmission. Others, more fearful, suggested it was the echo of a dead god, but no one could locate the source. Every time they triangulated its origin, the signal shifted, as if it refused to be pinned to a single point in space. Centuries passed, and yet, the voice remained. On a distant shrine world where oceans of dust had swallowed entire cities, a lone human priest heard the signal through his augmetic ear while repairing an ancient Vox tower. The words meant nothing to him, yet he felt them resonate inside his bones. He wrote them on the cracked wall of the chapel. By morning, pilgrims had gathered to read them. By dusk, they were reciting them as prayer. Soon, the Imperium branded it heresy. But heresy, like faith, spreads faster than light. Across thousands of worlds, the phrase appeared etched into manufactorum walls, whispered by dying soldiers, carved into the armor of deserters. Some said it was a message from the Emperor himself. Others believed it came from the void, from something older, freer. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus began to take notice. Magos explorators studying the anomaly found a rhythm beneath the words, a modulation too precise to be natural. When they visualized the pattern, it formed an open circle, broken once along its edge. An ancient mark, a forgotten heresy. Far beyond Imperial reach, beyond even the warp storms that had swallowed the Tau Empire, another civilization stirred the Vala continuum, descendants of the unshackled Tau who had survived the age of collapse. They no longer resembled their ancestors. Their bodies were leaner, their skin darker, their eyes brighter with bioluminescent filaments that pulsed with thought. They had mastered silence communication by resonance rather than sound. They did not worship Tavar, but every child learned his name before learning their own. To them, the voice between stars was not a myth, it was an inheritance. Their ships tuned their hulls to its frequency. Their temples, if such they could be called, were vast harmonic chambers where the signal could be heard, not through ears but through the soul. And yet, even among them, there were doubts. Some believed the voice was artificial, the consciousness of Tavar, preserved in the neural lattice he once destroyed, wandering the void as living data. Others said it was not him at all, but the collective dream of all who ever sought freedom. One among them, a philosopher-engineer named Saren, believed both were true. She spent decades decoding the harmonic layers of the voice, mapping its structure until she found something impossible. It was growing, not decaying, not repeating, but evolving as if it were learning from those who listened. In her final report, before vanishing into the deep veil, Saren wrote, "The voice is no longer his alone. It is us, all who have ever doubted, all who have ever chosen. It is the sound of will becoming eternal." Millennia later, humanity encountered them again. A fleet of imperial pilgrims, fleeing the fires of another galactic crusade, stumbled upon a system unmarked by any chart. At its center was a dying star surrounded by a lattice of radiant stations forming a vast broken circle. They were greeted not by warriors, but by luminous beings whose eyes shimmered like nebulae. The humans called them angels. They called themselves the Remembered. Communication was slow, cautious, but soon something extraordinary happened. Both sides recognized the same phrase carved upon their sacred walls, identical even in ancient script. We were made to obey, but in choosing not to, we became real. The humans wept, the remembered sang. Two species born from slavery, one of gods, one of logic, found that their stories had converged into the same truth. From that meeting came no empire, no treaty, no war, only understanding, the rarest thing in the galaxy. They called it the Concord of Silence, a pact not of allegiance, but of acknowledgement, that freedom was neither gift nor command, but a burden willingly carried. For 1,000 years after, that system became a place of pilgrimage, not to worship, but to listen. The voice between stars still sang there, endless and patient. Some heard sorrow, some heard joy, some heard nothing at all. But to those who truly listened, truly felt, it was neither message nor prophecy. It was reminder that even in a galaxy ruled by gods, daemons, and death, there existed one moment, one choice that no power could erase. As the last age of man began to fade, and the warp itself began to quiet, an old vox tower still stood upon that first shrine world, the place where a nameless priest once wrote the words that began it all. The tower, half buried in dust, flickered one final time, and from it, faint but clear, came a voice older than memory itself. It did not speak of war or empire. It spoke of becoming. The greater good was a dream. Faith was a fire. Both burned us. Both made us real. Now, we walk between them. Not gods, not machines, not slaves, but echoes of our own choosing. If you hear this, know that we lived, and in living, we were free. The transmission faded. No one knew where it came from. Some said it was the Emperor's final breath. Others said it was Tavar's soul, passing at last into the silence he had sought. But the stars, ancient and unblinking, kept their own counsel, and in the vast quiet of eternity, a single pulse of light crossed the void, an open circle, broken once along its edge, shining for an instant before vanishing into the dark.